We are now at 10:16, and it is time to start up Jonathan Frye's workshop on the science of sexuality. I have a PowerPoint that looks like it's ready to come up and running. And I just want to say, does science give us all the answers? Not, definitely not. Does science help us with a better understanding, with getting clarity on assumptions that we make? Well, it most definitely does. And Jonathan's workshop is a great time for asking questions, clearing up misperceptions, and getting accurate scientific information. So I welcome Jonathan, Dr. Frye. He's a professor at McPherson College in biology. And if he wants to say more about himself, go for it. Jonathan, it's your time.
Well, and Vicki, remember, this is a CEU event. So be in touch with Joanna or me if you would like CEUs.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I really don't want to say a whole lot more about myself. I'll tell you a little bit about the presentation I'll make. I have 14 slides. About the first half of them are sort of an introduction to biology, as I might do with a freshman biology class. And the second half are specifically about human biology, genetics, and gender and sexuality kind of issues. And so one title for this talk would be The Science of Sexuality, and that would be partially true, and because there is going to be some science and there will be some talk of human sexuality. Another possible title would have been The Genetics of Gender. That also would be partially true. There will be some genetics and discussion of what makes for human gender. So a little bit of the history of biology. Here, this is me in professor mode. So from ancient times, Aristotle, maybe up to the 1600s, the study of biology emphasized the diversity of life on Earth, kind of what lives and where it lives on the planet. And we emphasized particularly the study of things that might be useful to humans. So those species and their traits, if they're good as food or fuel or for fiber, for pharmaceuticals, medical compounds from the plants or animals, and if the animals particularly are useful for doing work. So science, as it was during that long period up until the 1600s, also emphasized observation of the world around us. We kind of looked around and saw what was there and didn't do a lot of experimentation, which is a more recent development in the history of science and of biology. So the old definition of biology, good from Aristotle's time up into probably into the 1800s, was that biology was the study of living organisms. But from the 1800s into the mid-1900s, the definition of biology changed, and now biologists concentrate on something a little bit different. So they noticed that there was a lot of diversity in life on Earth, but that amongst all those diverse living things, there were a few characteristics that all these living organisms shared in common. And so the modern definition of biology is the study of the living condition, or what it takes to be alive. The study of these characteristics which are shared by all life on Earth. And so in my introductory biology classes, we spend actually the whole first semester going through this short list of characteristics with more detail and examples than I'll get to here in the next 10 minutes. But this list is not too long, and it's not beyond the grasp of any of us all here. So the 6 characteristics that all living things have in common. One is that they consist of one or more cells. This was something that biologists were only able to observe after a microscope, lenses that could magnify objects and make them appear larger than they actually are. Microscopes had been invented and developed. And in the 1830s, biologists, having spent about 150 years looking at lots of different living things under the microscope, concluded that they all consisted of one or more cells. So life is either unicellular, living organisms that are single cells, or like all of the animals and plants and many of the fungi, like humans, life is multicellular. Also, all living things take in energy and matter in some form or other and release waste products to their environment. And they process that energy and matter internally. And that whole process is called their metabolism. So all living things are metabolic. All living things are able to sense and respond to changes in the world around them, their external environment, and also sense and respond to changes in their internal environment. And the technical word for that ability to sense and respond to changes is that they are irritable. So life is cellular, life is metabolic, life is irritable. And then living things all use their irritability, their ability to sense and respond to changes in their environment, and their metabolism. They use those two things together to maintain a relatively constant internal environment, mostly having to do with their internal chemistry. So the pH of the fluid inside of your cells is pretty much the same all throughout your life. And it's also pretty much the same pH as the inside of all living cells. So it's remarkably uniform across all living things. Number 5 here is that all living things come from other similar living organisms. They are the product of reproduction. I've had over the years trouble with students in classes who kind of mistake this term to say that all living things reproduce. And I'll point out to them that although I have children, many of my students have not had children. And they are still alive, even though they have not reproduced. But if I ask them how many of them have a mother and a father, how many of them had parents, that's 100%. So everyone was born, everyone is the product of reproduction. So in the last couple of years, I actually have gone to just saying that life is continuous. Life flows on from cell to cell, from generation to generation. And then the last of these characteristics for biologists to recognize is true of all living things on Earth, is that they all have DNA as their genetic material. And so all life is genetic. And remarkably, DNA, which is a molecule that contains 4 different smaller parts to that molecule, and those 4 letters form a language, and you can write little words, 3-letter long words. So it's a language that has 64 different words. Those words stand for amino acids that cells might use to build proteins. And all living things seem to understand the genetic language in the same way. So we're all using the same alphabet. We're all using the same vocabulary. And that is for you and whales and bacteria and everything else. They all speak the same genetic language. And so modern biologists study these 6 characteristics as they are exhibited by the variety of different living things on the planet. Okay, so these are true of all living things. Now, humans and actually all of the animals are multicellular organisms. And so there are some things which only multicellular organisms do, and we're going to turn our attention to those for just a bit. So, multicellular organisms share some of these processes with the unicellular ones. So all living things have to be able to make a copy of the DNA, the genetic material that's in their cells. And all living things have cells that are capable of dividing into two cells. And in organisms like humans, animals, plants, the name of that process of cell division is mitosis. And so you end up with two cells that are nearly identical to one another. Sometimes, however, in multicellular organisms, one cell will divide into two, but those two cells will have different fates. They will become different from one another. So your body consists of cells, for instance, like muscle cells and nerve cells and blood cells and cells in your skin and cells in your liver, and they are quite different from one another. They all arise by a process of cell differentiation. And that's something that multicellular organisms do, but unicellular organisms, not so much. And then as a multicellular organism grows, it grows by cell division and cell differentiation, and it grows into an organism that changes over the life of the organism. So you were once a single cell. You divided and you became two cells, you became 4 cells and 8 cells. Some point along the line there, your cells became different from one another, and they became epidermal cells, cells on your skin, muscle cells, other kinds of cells. And so you were developing, and you continue to develop the entire time you were in utero, and you continue to develop after you're born. Keep growing and changing, and you continue to develop until you die. I am still developing. You all are still developing, and development is common amongst multicellular organisms. And many multicellular organisms can also do a special kind of cell division, and following a round of DNA replication, in which they produce differentiated cells, unusual cells, that are called gametes. And so egg and sperm cells. And that process of cell division has a different name there. It's meiosis. It's 2 rounds of cell division with only 1 round of DNA copying. And so you end up with these 2 cells which are capable then of fusing together. So an egg and a sperm cell can fuse and become a single cell. That's called a zygote. And that zygote, or fertilized egg, is now a cell that is genetically distinct from both of its parents. It is a cell. The sperm cell was a cell. The egg cell was a cell. The mother that gave rise to the egg cell was a live collection of cells. The father that gave rise to the sperm cell was a live collection of cells. So these 2 individuals were alive, their cells were alive, their cells fused and became another living cell. And this cell is now genetically distinct from its 2 parents. And multicellular organisms, animals, plants, fungi, they're all capable, each species is capable of this kind of reproduction. Scientists, because they realize that all living things share these organisms in common, and that it's, practically speaking, easier to study some organisms than others, have chosen a short list of organisms to study more intensely, because these organisms are easier to study, easier to work with in the lab, easier to do experiments on. And one of those is this organism here, whose name is a real mouthful, Chinorhabditis elegans. Most folks call it C. elegans. They just kind of abbreviate the genus name there. It is a little worm. It's only about less than 1/10 of an inch long when it's an adult. It's a little round worm, a kind of worm called a nematode. And it was chosen for study because it is small and easily grown. It's transparent, so you can look at a live adult worm and you can see right inside of it and see what's going on inside. You can see the individual cells in it. And as an adult organism, it has fewer than 1,000 cells in its body. And so patient, careful, observing scientists have watched it divide from a single fertilized egg cell till it divides into 2 cells, and then watched each of those cells as they divided and divided and divided, and has mapped out the fate of every cell and every cell division, leading to the adult nematode. 959 cells. There was a little discussion in the break between the Joanna's presentation and this about billions and billions, the billions of stars in the galaxy and the billions of galaxies in the universe. There are also billions of cells in a person. And watching the fate of every cell as a person develops is kind of beyond the scope of science. But mapping it out in this C. elegans worm is not. And so we have a complete kind of cellular fate map for this species. Now, most of my students, and perhaps most of you, are much more interested in people than you are in nematodes, in tiny little, worms in the soil. And so what do we know about humans from all this biology in the last 150 years? Well, we know that people are organisms, living things, and that we are multicellular, metabolic, irritable, homeostatic, genetic offspring of other people. So we have all the characteristics of living organisms. And every one of us has grown from a zygote, a fertilized egg, and we've grown as our cells have replicated our DNA, and the cells have divided and differentiated, and our bodies have developed. And all of this growth and development occurs under the combined influences of our genetics, the DNA that's in our cells, and under the environment that they're dividing and differentiating and developing in. So it's the combined influence of those two things. So that's the intro to biology part of the course. And I'll just, course presentation. I'll stop there for a moment. If anyone has any questions about the biology part, I'd be happy to answer those, or we'll move on into the gender and sexuality part. So unmute yourself and speak up.
Jonathan, at one point in my life, when we were studying all of that, it was just pointed out to us that this is how earthly beings exist and reproduce. And we were trying to figure out, what if we went to another planet or another galaxy? Would we see the same thing? Who knows? But I just point that out.
Okay, other questions or comments? Okay, so then the gender and sexuality parts. We'll start with gender because it's easier to define and easier to think about how a scientist would study gender than sexuality is. So one way in which we might define gender is a kind of definition called the chromosomal definition. And so we look at a person's within a cell, and if you take a cell and you squash it, kind of pop it open, and then look at it under a microscope, and you've stained it just the right way, you can see the genetic material that's in a cell. And what I've shown here is a picture of the 23 pairs of chromosomes that you would find in a person. And I don't know if you can, well, they're numbered. So starting in the upper left-hand corner of that picture is the pair of chromosomes, pair number 1. It's called pair number 1 because it is the largest chromosome. And then they're arranged in order 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, all the way down to 22 near the bottom there, which is the smallest pair of chromosomes. One of each of those pairs is a copy of the genetic material you inherited from your mother, and the other one of each pair is a copy of the genetic material you inherited from your father. Then there's the 23rd pair, and in some individuals, those chromosomes are very similar to one another. They're both the larger of the pair there shown in the bottom right-hand corner, and they're called X chromosomes. So you might have 2 X chromosomes, or you have one large chromosome and one small one in the 23rd pair. They're different, and the little one is called the Y chromosome. And typically, folks inherit, if they are XY, they have inherited the Y from their father and the X from their mother, and those individuals are chromosomally male. And individuals who have 2 X chromosomes inherited 1 X from their mother and 1 X from their father, and they are chromosomally female. So that's the chromosomal definition. Then there's also, before scientists knew about DNA and chromosomes and had invented microscopes, there's the anatomical definitions of male and female. And that's the one that doctors use when babies are born. Baby comes out into the world, doctor looks at the baby and looks for anatomy. And if the doctor sees certain anatomy, doctor says, congratulations, you have a baby boy. And if the doctor doesn't see that anatomy, the doctor says, congratulations, you have a baby girl. So the anatomical definition. And these definitions are both what we call dichotomous definitions. There are 2 possibilities. You're either XX or XY. You either have the male body parts or you don't. You're either male or you're female. But, go on to my next slide here. There is a lot of variability. If you look around the Zoom room, at folks we're not all alike. And there is variability even at the chromosomal level. So if you did those kinds of looking at the chromosomes of lots of people, you would find that although most people are either XX or XY, there are some individuals who have 3 X chromosomes. They don't have 23 pairs, 46 total chromosomes, they have 47. And the extra one is another copy of an X chromosome. Or maybe they have 2 X's and a Y, or an X and 2 Ys, or 4 X's, or 3 X's and a Y, and so on. So there's, several percent of the human population is chromosomally neither XX or XY. There's something other than those 2 options. And all of those where they have an unusual number of chromosomes are conditions called aneuploidy. At the anatomical level, because human development is this complex interaction of our genetics and our environment over the whole course of our lives, and there are lots of genes involved in how humans grow and develop. People grow and develop differently. And so there are some individuals who anatomically do not fall neatly into one of those 2 categories. They have both sets of genitalia. They don't have either external, it's not apparent externally what their anatomy is. And so what their gender is if you're using the anatomical definition. And one example of a condition that is both anatomical and has a genetic underpinning is a condition called complete androgen insensitivity syndrome. So this is an individual who has 46 chromosomes. they have an X and a Y chromosome. So they are chromosomally normal, they are chromosomally male, but they have a mutation, a change in a gene. And it's not, by the way, on either the X or the Y chromosomes, but it's a gene that tells your cells how to make a particular protein. That protein is typically found expressed on the surface of a cell, and it's the protein that interacts with testosterone. And so if your body produces testosterone, and everyone's does, both men and women produce testosterone. Men typically produce more testosterone than women, but everyone produces this hormone, and it affects the growth and development of your cells. These individuals who have complete androgen insensitivity syndrome, their cells are not irritable to testosterone. They cannot sense testosterone. They don't respond to testosterone. And so, as they are growing and developing, and their little gonads, which haven't yet become either their testes or their ovaries, but the gonads are producing testosterone and their bodies don't respond to it. And so they develop anatomically as females, but they are genetically male. They are chromosomally male and anatomically female. And when they're born, the doctor looks at them and says that they are female. And even if they did the chromosomal test, they would not discover that, it would only be then that they would discover that they are chromosomally male. And so that's not usually done. So individuals are usually born and raised as females when they have this condition, but they are chromosomally male. There was a case of an Olympic athlete, a woman, born and raised a woman, track athlete, who they did this chromosomal test on her when she was going to compete in the Olympics, and they informed her that she could not compete as a woman in the Olympics because she was a man, which was news to her, 20 years old. And so the anatomical definition, the chromosomal definition, and we might look at all approximately 30,000 genes in people and what all of those genes are, because the genes that control your development are not all found on the X and the Y chromosome. So your development is dependent on all of your genetics. So it's hard to define gender genetically or scientifically, and it does not fall neatly into just two boxes. And that is true with people. It is also true with other species. There are a lot of fungi who have three distinct genders. Okay, so that's several different ways of defining gender. And then one's gender identity, is how you are taught what it means to be a person in that gender. And that kind of socialization, being raised as a boy or girl, affects your sense of your gender identity. And how it is that one's brain grows and develops is complex and is beyond science. So as a scientist, I'm not going to say, we know that boys' brains develop this way, girls' brains develop that way. They're distinct and different, and there are only two kinds of brain development. And, we could do some kind of scan of your brain and tell you whether it's a boy brain or a girl brain. There do seem to be some differences, but they're not found in all people who would identify as the one gender or the other. And so it's not a clear-cut distinction there either. Another way of finding out what a person's gender identity is to ask them, what is your sense of yourself? And they will respond. you know, my sense of myself is that I am a male. My sense of myself is that I am a female. Or my sense of myself is that I don't fit neatly into one of those two boxes, but I would describe myself in some other way, as transgender, as queer, as uncertain about my gender. So questioning. That's all the gender part. We'll talk briefly about sexuality and sexual preference here. So I'm in an area where I wouldn't even pretend to be an expert. So I'm quoting here, but a definition of sexuality is what leads one to be emotionally, spiritually, physically, or sexually attracted to persons of the same gender or the opposite gender, or of two genders, or of all genders, or however gender might be defined. But it has something to do with attraction to others. And besides the direction of that attraction, I'm attracted to this sort of a person. If you compare one individual to another, different people have a different strength of attraction. So they feel their sexuality more strongly or less strongly. And that changes over the course of your life. It's unlikely that you would describe your own sexuality the same today as you did when you were 10 years old or 2 years old, you know, or 20, or whatever ages are less than your current age. It's a fairly gray-haired bunch out there, but yeah. Okay, so, you know, over the course of your life, your sexuality changes. And that, your sexuality is kind of what you are thinking and feeling. It's internal to you. And so other people only know about that if you share that with them. And then there's your sexual expression, so how you behave. And both of those things are a lot more complex than gender, let's say. Difficult to study, you know, and beyond really, I think, the complete understanding of science. So, you know, what does all of this have to do with our life together in the church? And I do think it raises some significant questions about how we understand the relationship between ourselves and God, and between God and God's creation and the goodness of God's creation. I think it raises some awareness of our limitations, not just as scientists, but just as people generally, that it's probably beyond us as an individual to fully understand another person's situation as they experience it from the inside. And given the questions that this raises and the awareness of our limitations that it raises, I think the most helpful attitude to bring to questions like this is one of humility, of a sense of humbleness or lowness in your own approach to this. And that the opposite of humility, and you know, maybe you can come up with a better word than arrogance. Pride would be one, but you know, a high sense of your own understanding. That arrogance has been a source of a lot of problems in our life together. So when I think I know you better than you know you, and I think I can tell you about you better than you can tell yourself about yourself, then we get into turmoil in the church. So I would leave it at that, you know, and if there are questions or discussion about those topics, or I can scroll back through any of the slides and, you know, respond to those.
Jonathan's Joanna.
Yes, Joanna.
I had a question, and I can't pronounce this. It's on your slide, but at the chromosomal level, I'm wondering if you have a percentage of what the percentage of persons that are aneuploidy.
Yeah, it's in the single digits. So something less than 10, but I think something more than 1 in the population. So it's not just a fraction of a percent. One of the examples of aneuploidy that you might be familiar with leads to Down syndrome. So that's an extra copy of chromosome 18 or 21. I think there are a couple of different trisomies that lead to Down syndrome. And I was thinking of this first time I gave this talk, which was maybe 8 years ago. And so how many of you, of those viewing today, know someone with Down syndrome? You think, okay, yeah. And you know that they have Down syndrome because it's readily apparent. You can see it. You know the signs, the symptoms of Down syndrome. People with one of the various disorders of sexual development that leads to indistinct, not clearly male or female gender is about the same frequency in the population as Down syndrome is, but it's not apparent. So if you know someone with Down syndrome, it is just as likely that you know someone with a disorder of sexual development, but you don't know that you know them.
Hi, this is Sue Smith. I took a course at Bethany titled Sex, Gender, and Theology with Nate Inglis. And I was fascinated with the intersex statistics that I had no idea of. And, they also call them hermaphrodites, which is somewhat politically incorrect right now, right? They say 1 in 1,500 to 1 in 2,000 are born intersex. But what was really interesting was a documentary, and I'm not sure exactly which title I tried to look at, but we watched in that class about how doctors have pushed parents very early on when the baby, comes out and doesn't have one or the other or both or whatever genitalia, to pick one of those genders and do the surgery right then, and how that has harmed so many people. And so now parents are trying to wait to see what gender they are more like, or even waiting to see if they choose to have that surgery or just leave themselves as that. So it was very interesting to me and something that really spoke to theology too.
Yeah, I think I understood everything you said, although the sound was garbled. So I'll just repeat it in case it was garbled for anybody else. But questions about, or that you'd taken a course with Nate Inglis at Bethany, that in the course you looked at individuals who were, studies of individuals who were intersex. So they're at birth, their genitalia are indistinct. And that over the course of the last 100 years or so, doctors, when they were capable of doing those kinds of surgeries, would often perhaps pressure the parents to choose a gender for their child and then to tidy up the anatomy surgically shortly after birth. And that does not always work out well for the individual. They may, as they develop, come to a sense of themselves that is different from the one that the doctor gave them, when they were 1 week old.
I have a question.
Yes, is that
Kim?
okay?
Kim Theory, Osage Church. Back to that slide on the
Aneuploidy.
Yeah, this one.
No,
No,
the aneuploidy.
I mean, I can spell it.
And
For
you
you.
The
There we go.
aneuploidy? Yes.
So you might have said this and I just missed it, but earlier you were talking about where they have the testosterone block, and so gonads don't go ahead and form as the testicles. Is that included in under that chromosome? Like if that happened, is it because of that chromosomal abnormality? Or is that a separate thing that can happen as well?
That particular one is a separate thing. So that's the complete androgen insensitivity syndrome that's down below. And those individuals are chromosomally normal, but they have just a mutation in this one gene that makes them, although they are chromosomally male, makes them develop anatomically as females.
Okay, and do you have numbers on that as well?
It's less than 1%. It's on the order of that 1 in 1,000, which is about 1/10 of 1%.
Okay, and then, but okay, so the one where they have either no genitalia or they have both genitalia, is that a chromosomal
They can be.
abnormality? Okay.
Yeah. And so individuals who are XXY are chromosomally like they are female and chromosomally like they are male. And they typically develop as males, but males with feminine characteristics. Yeah. You know, or
Okay.
they don't grow as thick a beard. So, you know, they might pass as male, as, you know, anatomically normal males. But, you know, they're not clearly in one of the two categories.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Jonathan, this is Gail. Oh, go ahead, Barb.
No, go ahead.
I got an airplane.
I
Go,
guess
Gail.
Barb is up.
Okay. I just have a question. You're using normal, abnormal, order, disorder. Those who are finding themselves in that bracket, I think would take a little bit, it would be offensive, I guess.
Mhm.
Because if God created me with XXXX, hello, is this really abnormal? It would not be abnormal to me.
Right. And so if I, back up there and say 90% of people fall neatly into one of the two boxes. And so that is the most common. Maybe it'd be a better word than normal. So the typical, the most common.
Yeah.
Okay?
Because then it gets into the stereotype of I'm normal, you're not, or
Right.
you're a disorder. You have a disorder.
Right. And I'll say that for about the past 15 years, I've been teaching a course in epidemiology and public health, but it's kind of a specifically, medical emphasis on the course. So human health, and also a biomedical ethics course. And the medical profession has a hard time defining health. And I mean, they don't even try. Like the American Medical Association does not have a definition they publish of health. They have lots of definitions of diseases and syndromes and disorders. But they don't have a definition of health. And that's just kind of across the boards in medical, stuff. So they're all about defining normalcy negatively by, here is where it's not normal. This is not normal. This is a disorder. This is a disease. What does it look like to be a healthy, whatever? They don't really define that. And the question that I have here at the top, topics for questions. So is God's creation good? beginning of Genesis, God creates everything, and God looks out at it all and says it's good. And, is God messing up? Okay, are these individuals God's mistakes? Well, okay. Is it punishment for sin? Did the parents do some sin and God is punishing the parents by inflicting this child on them? Or did the child sin in utero or something? And this is a punishment, So how do you understand the way, you are, or this person is in the world as a part of God's creation?
I think if this is Pat, if God created and said it's good, then we're the problem. Then we're the problem with not, accepting people as they are and wanting to be either male or female completely. I don't think God can mess up. Personally, that's how I feel. I have another question, actually. Is this in all species, these statistics of how the chromosomes can differentiate? Is that?
So species are different. Now, the number of pairs of chromosomes we have, that we have 23, that is not unique to humans, because there are millions of different species, and it's not like there's only one that has 23, one that has 24, and so on. So, and all of the sexually reproducing species, so all plants and animals and, many of the fungi, they all have that process of both mitosis and meiosis. And in either of those processes, when the cells are dividing, sometimes exactly half of the chromosomes don't end up in one cell and the other half in the other cell. So you end up with both of the X's in the one egg and neither of the X's in the other egg, which is where the aneuploidy things come from. And that can happen in any species that reproduces sexually.
Oh, okay.
Other species don't have an X and Y chromosome pair that is normally, most of the time, linked with gender. So, and in humans, it's not the Y chromosome that has a whole bunch of genes on it that make it male. That's not how human gender is determined. But in some species, all of the pairs of chromosomes are similar to one another. And the genes that determine how the organism grows and develops are scattered across the different chromosomes. And it's the assortment that determines the gender. In some cases, the individuals that have the two sex chromosomes that are alike are male, whereas in humans, if you have the two that are alike, the two X's, you are chromosomally female. Yeah. So there's a wide variety of things. And then in all species that have gender, there are some species in which an individual has both genders, produces both ovaries and testes, produces both egg and sperm, is both male and female. There are some species where there are individuals that are only male and individuals that are only female. And there are some species that have more than two genders. They've got like 3 different pairs of chromosomes that might determine, and either one of the genders can mate successfully with either of the other 2 genders. But there are 3 distinct ones in some species.
Wow.
This is Jonathan, you have, excuse me, a couple of questions in the chat box as well.
Okay, I can't see that.
Okay.
I'm in the screen sharing mode, so.
Okay, from Sue Smith, she asked, do you agree with about a 4% homosexual rate in humans, and that almost all species are also known to have this rate of homosexuality as well, or even higher in many species?
So I'll answer first kind of like the scientist guy, which is, so how you would know that a person is homosexual, which is that they are attracted, their sexuality is that they're attracted to people of the same gender as them, is by asking them and having them tell you, or by observing them expressing their attraction to other individuals of the same gender. Which is to say that I don't know what's going on in your head, and I don't follow you around all day and observe your behavior and over the entire course of your life. And so it's very hard for scientists to know what percentage of the population is, homosexual. Is it 4%? Is it 5%? Is it 2%? I don't know. And they have done surveys, they've asked people, and maybe that percentage of the folks in the survey respond yes, to that question. But some people won't respond to surveys. Some people aren't included in the surveys. Some people lie on their answers to surveys. Some people maybe don't know, and so respond honestly, but so any particular number I don't have a lot of confidence in. And then if you compare that to other species, we know a whole lot less about robin sexuality than we do about human sexuality. But behavioral ecologists, folks who observe the behavior of other animal species, observe occasional contact between individuals that they would identify as being of the same gender of those species. And so whether the one animal and the other are sexually attracted to one another, we don't know, but they will do sexual things with one another. So there's a behavior there, and that occurs in some small percent, probably less than 10%, but in most species that scientists have bothered to observe. So it seems to be widespread in the animal kingdom that individuals exhibit some same-sex sexual behaviors.
And then the last one on here is from Diane Patton. And she asked, how does our name, male names versus female names, also play a role in our development?
Yeah, so part of your development is, is your socialization. So you're taught how to be a person when you're a little person, and if you're dressed in pink frilly dresses and I call you Sally, and you grow up thinking, the other people wearing pink frilly dresses and with names like that are women, and so I must be a woman. So you would learn that. I don't know that a 1-year-old thinks much about what their gender is, or so it's a subtle influence on their development. And it's common across cultures and across human history, but also it's common in some cultures to treat children as though they don't have a gender, to treat them sort of neutrally. I know I've got some pictures somewhere of, my great grandfather or something, where little boys were dressed in girls' clothes at a young age. So it's easier to change their diapers if you don't take pants off. We just kind of pull the gown up. Yeah, I don't know how it affected them, but everything you experience in your life does affect you.
Jonathan, this is Gail. I have
Yes, Gail.
Probably 2 questions. So aneuploidy, if I said that right, will that have any prediction on who is going to be identify as gay or lesbian
I don't think so, no. I mean, they are really rare, and they're rarer conditions than being gay or lesbian is.
Right.
And so kind of the statistics of it, most folks who would identify as gay or lesbian are going to have 46 chromosomes, you know, the usual complement, and won't be aneuploid.
Right. And then science depends a lot on twin studies.
Mm-hmm.
Is there an effect of twins on this intersex or any of these variations?
Yeah, so twin studies, and particularly interested scientists are on identical twins or homozygotic twins. So those are two individual people who started out as a single zygote. There was one egg, one sperm fused, formed one zygote. The zygote divided into two cells, and then at some point, those cells, or early in the cell division, the cells got separated from one another, and then each went on to develop into a person who is, you know, anatomically, physically distinct from the other, able to walk apart from one another, but they are genetically identical at birth, or at conception, I should say. They're genetically identical. However, even identical twins develop at different places in the uterus, and over the course of their entire lives, they develop in slightly different environments. And so although their genetics might be the same at the start, their environments are different. So they become more and more different from one another as their lives go on. And there are only so many of those folks born, and scientists are anxious to study all of them if they could, because they provide an opportunity to study the relative effects of genetics and environment on development. And particularly identical twins who are given up at birth by their parents and are adopted into different families, so that they are genetically identical, but their environments are quite different. And then you see how similar they turn out or how different they turn out. So there are groups of twins that have been sort of registered with scientists, and you know, they come back and they ask them lots of questions. They study lots of different things about these same individuals, and some of them are, you know, the pair of twins are both genetically and identify as male, some both female, and there are very few, but a few, that fall into either the aneuploidy category, in which case both of the twins have the same genetic condition. And then there are some where the twins, it's probably an environmental thing, but they develop differently. So they, as they develop through adolescence and into adulthood, develop different gender identities and different sexualities. But whether that is entirely due to environment or it's due to a subtle difference in their genetics. So even if they're chromosomally like one another, every time a cell divides, it has to copy all of its DNA before it divides. And our cells make mistakes. So there are little mutations, and they accumulate every time cells divide. There's, you know, the probability of some new mutation, and the mutations in one of the twins would likely be different than the mutation in another twin. So they become genetically different as time goes by as well.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Jonathan, it is 11:15 according to my time zone. And this brings us to the end of our scheduled time for you. And we're moving into a break. I don't know if you're willing, if there are folks who still have questions, who want to chat and and keep the conversation going if you're willing to do that. But I want to let folks be free to check out of this workshop. Thank you so much. I learned stuff, got new big words. I got questions, but I don't know that I'll ask them right now. But it just very interesting information and stuff to think about. So I hope everybody has a little something new that they're taking away, and then how to think theologically about all of this. That's not been the focus. You offered the question, several questions at the end here, but or statements, I guess. Mm-hmm. But I do think for the church, it's what does this mean for us and our church and faith communities? Not your focus, but that's where I believe the conversation continues for us as science continues to tell us about the biology of our creation. So do you have any final thing you want to say?
No, but I'm happy to stay on if folks have questions. I came over to the college to my office for this, and apparently on Saturdays, on weekends, my building is not being air conditioned. And I didn't realize that till I got here. It was kind of too late to turn back. So it's maybe 85 to 90 in my office at the moment. I'm planning to head home and do the afternoon business session from there. It's only a couple of blocks away. So. Okay.
All right. Well, you can't check the chat, I don't think, but there I'm seeing a lot of.
If I stop sharing.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Great.
I'll see the chat. So, and I can see everyone else that was kind of hidden before. Okay.
So thank you very much. This workshop is officially closed, but hang around and chat if you wish. We're taking a break for lunch. And then at noon, my time, 1 o'clock Kansas time, you can connect back in, see if your your technology parts and pieces are working. And our business session begins at 12:30. So I look forward to seeing you all then. Anything else anybody needs to say, announcements wise?
I would just tell Susan that I read her cute story in the chat, and thank you for sharing that. Yes.
I would just add, I think Leslie said we were supposed to break in terms of our being on the Zoom conference call. Mm-hmm. We were supposed to break for lunch. Did I understand that right?
Yes, and as soon as everybody's finished with their questions, if they want to keep Jonathan in his office of 90 degrees, hint, hint, hint. I will be shutting down because I need to shut off the YouTube video and shut this down so that we can continue in our, and make it the worship tonight.
Okay. Okay. So
I hate to be the technical person, but sorry, guys.
It's okay.
Glad it's not me.
Yeah, you've been doing so well, Leslie. Don't
yeah, but I get to be that means I get to be, I have to be the bad guy too, so.
Okay, bye everybody.
Bye-bye. See you in 45 minutes.
Okay.
All righty.
Jonathan, did you see the question in the chat? You might be able to answer that as things are shutting down. There's a new one. I can get it. It's from
I see. Yeah.
From Judy Herr.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So it is possible that in a set of twins, one could be homosexual and the other not. But it doesn't mean that it's due entirely to genetics or necessarily not due to genetics. Yeah, and I will say there is no single gene for sexuality. There's no single gene for most traits that people have. So if you think about something as simple as how tall you grow to be, in humans, that is controlled by a whole bunch of genes because you have to grow long bones and long muscles and long tendons. And there are a lot of things that have to coordinate. And so it's not just one gene to do something like that. There are very few traits actually that are controlled by a single gene. And sexuality is a very complex trait, and it is controlled, if it is controlled genetically, it's controlled by a whole bunch of interacting genes that you would have inherited some of and not others of, and be very complex genetic.
All the more reason to be humble.
There we go.
Good point.
So Jonathan, I have a question. If female is XX and male is XY, what is X?
What's on the X chromosome?
What is X, or what is Y? Is Y the anomaly? You know, is X the predominant? Everybody needs a good X.
Yeah, everyone does need a good X, because the X chromosome, the bigger of that pair, it has a whole bunch of genes on it that have really, most of them, nothing to do with gender, but they have to do with other important things that everybody's cells need to do. So enzymes that you need for your metabolism, or you need, for those basic processes of life. So everyone needs to have all of the genes that are on the X chromosome. The Y chromosome only has a few genes, and clearly they're not necessary genes, because folks who are XX don't have a Y. They're getting along just fine without whatever those couple of genes are that control things like male pattern baldness or something. I don't know. It's just a few kind of unnecessary traits in people that are on the Y chromosome.
Jonathan, Lauren Worley. I'm not a biologist. That was never my subject. So I found this all very interesting. Politically, this has been such a hot topic, but in the political discussions, I've never heard any of the biological explanations that you gave me, and kind of curious to why we haven't heard that discussion.
Okay, so I'm not a political scientist either, but I'm just somebody jump in and correct me if you think I'm headed off base here. In the United States, our politics was set in motion 220 whatever years ago. And the understanding of gender, and race and other things at the time was a lot different than it is today. So a lot of, public discourse got started, the language of it and all got started in a different time and place. What is a person in the Constitution? And then, it didn't include African Americans were not whole people. They were only 3/5 of a person. So there's a historical reason why the debate today is framed the way it is. But as a scientist and a person living in the 21st century and the third millennium and all, I'm willing to update my understanding of how the world works and the way things are, and to try to adjust my language, to fit that. And that's hard to do. If you've learned one way of speaking, it's hard to, train yourself to not use the things you learned as a small child. And so, the phrase, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, that kind of rolls off the tongue because I heard it, at the intro to the circus or something when I went as a little kid, and not because it reflects my best current understanding of the nature of gender in the human species. Right.
So Jonathan, a question popped into my head, and I feel really torn with it. You said a person could be male and female. Was that my understanding, or at least possess male and female parts?
Yes. Yeah. So individuals, an intersex individual may be born. I'm just going to go, like the biologist here. Okay.
Okay.
So they have a vagina. They also have a penis.
Okay. So the question that popped in my head that's screaming at me not to ask this is I thought of the Virgin Mary. Is it possible for a female that comes of age that has male and female reproductive organs, can that female become pregnant at the age of, say, 14, 15?
Okay. So in species where that's more common, earthworms or something, the answer is yes. If you were asking about could the person fertilize themselves? So yes. Humans that are intersex, if they have testes, they don't have ovaries, and or vice versa. So they had one set of gonads and they end up somewhere. And so a single human individual would produce either sperm or eggs, but they wouldn't have gonads in both places. And so,
thank you.
They wouldn't be able to self-fertilize.
Okay, I feel a lot better. Thank you.
And this is one other biological thing. There are some species, it's more common amongst the fish than it is amongst mammals, where they can go through something called parthenogenesis, but the females, which produce the egg cells will start to divide and will grow and develop into offspring without being fertilized. And so the females are able to reproduce, and you can have a whole species of females only.
Wow, that's amazing. Well, thank you for putting my mind at ease. I hope no one's appalled or disgusted with me, or it just popped into my head.
It was a good question.
Yeah, or with me when I
Thank you.
Give you the biologist answer there. Sorry. So.
No, that's fine. That's fine.
So I'm going to suggest everybody take a half-hour break so that we can preserve a half an hour of our recording time.
Very good.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Thank you so much.
You're all welcome, and I'll be around virtually and in person. Anyway, I'd be happy to.
We'll probably get lots of chats this
so just
afternoon,
get in touch with
Jonathan.
me.
You'll get lots of chats this afternoon.
Very good.
Okay.
Take care, y'all. Bye-bye.
Have a nice lunch, everyone.